Hello there. So today I'm going to be talking about Kickstarter 3, and the funding for that ended about 24 hours ago. Raised a record-breaking amount, exceeded the totals of Kickstarter 1 and 2 combined, and over 1,000% over the base 250,000, which was the funding target. So people may be wondering, well, what happens now? And I wanted to just go through a few of those activities based on my experiences with Kickstarter 1 and Kickstarter 2. And I wanted to start with the case. So obviously we have two SKUs this time around. We have the black and we have the translucent purple. Now, it's not necessarily just a case of getting the molds out, using the parameters that we used previously, and then you get thousands of perfect cases coming out the other side. The realities are quite different, and injection molding can be quite an art form at times and not necessarily an exact science. There are a lot of parameters that you can tweak, and so when you are starting again, maybe a year or 2 years from when you last created cases, you do have to return to the start to an extent. You have a good understanding of things and how things work and how the mold behaves, but there's still an element of prototyping that needs to go on. And especially when you have the two different SKUs and your polymer might be slightly different between the black and the purple, and they may behave differently with the same injection parameters. Now, injection itself, there are a whole load of parameters that you can tweak around the injection molding to get the best possible product out the other end. You have the temperature of the polymer as it's being injected in. You have the temperature of the mold, for example, through water channels or oil channels. You can vary the temperature of the mold, and that will have an effect on how quickly that part cools, and that can help things like shrinkage, because shrinkage happens in injection molding, especially when the thing is cooling. You have the pressure that you're forcing that plastic into the mold. You have the flow rate in terms of how much plastic per second is being forced into the mold. You have the screw speed, which is how quickly the pellets are being digested, heated, melted, etc. You have the holding phase, where you're holding that case inside the mold. And then you have the cooling phase, how long you keep that to cool. And then you have the ejector phase, where you're basically popping that part out. And all these things can have an effect on the end product. And in previous Kickstarters, we've been through a lot of different iterations of case. You fix one problem, you create another. You are injecting from, say, thin sections to thin to thick sections, so pressure is higher when you're forcing it in. There are also areas of the case where there are some very narrow apertures where you have to ensure the plastic flows, especially around the left side of the case to the left of the keyboard, to make sure you don't get like a short shot. So there's quite a lot of work that needs to be done in order to get that. So again, it will go back to the prototype stages, and especially for the purple case, where it will behave slightly differently. And also you have to arrive at the right shade of magenta stroke purple. So that'll probably take a couple of attempts. You tend to provide the manufacturer with a sample. So you may find something online that you like the look of and you think, that's a really nice translucent purple. And you would send that to the manufacturer, and then they would try to colour match that. They have high technology stuff. High technology stuff? They have technical things that allow them to produce a colour match on a translucent product. So that first prototype may come back and you decide it's slightly off. You want it tweaking. They will go away, they'll do it again. You may not necessarily be wanting to refine the mold itself at that point, or the plastic at that point, because you may be looking for more of a colour match rather than is the case perfect. So you might go through an initial colour phase to iron that out, and then you would then start focusing on the quality of the finished product. And you do that for black and you do that for purple. And I'm going to put some pictures up here anyway because I'm talking and there's a black screen here at the moment. So I'm hoping after the fact in post, I'm going to put some pictures up there or videos or whatever of what I'm talking about. So yeah, injection molding will take a few iterations, I imagine. They typically get shipped from China to the UK. Industrial designer takes a look at them, makes observations, passes the feedback back. China then goes and tries to correct those issues without creating more issues. Obviously that's happening in a factory in China. There are other things happening in parallel. So you have the keyboard. Now the keyboard is a different manufacturer, and they are a UK-based manufacturer with a factory in China. The keyboard was a huge issue in Kickstarter 1. It took months, a year, 18 months maybe, because of that damn membrane and the 3-layer thing that old backers of Kickstarter 1 probably remember the pain that we went through with split contacts, etc. But that's all a thing of the past now. And all we need to establish from a keyboard point of view is the quality of the finished product and the keys, and looking for any defects that were experienced in Kickstarter 1 and Kickstarter 2 and make sure they don't present themselves. So really with the keyboard it should be a turnkey operation. You ask for however many thousand, and we're not going to find out yet how many have been pledged for because payments need to be taken. And obviously if payments fall through and backers decide, no, I'm not going to bother, then the numbers reduce. So once we have the numbers, they would be sent to the keyboard manufacturer to say, can you make 7,000 of these please, or 7,500 of these please? And then they would come back with timescales and delivery estimates. And because the factories in China and the other factories in China, they can just ship things direct to the factory for assembly to marry it up with the case. So that's kind of, the keyboard should be fairly simple, which is nice to have something which you can just count on. The next thing is the PCB, which, as people know, there are some changes happening on the PCB. We also have 2 SKUs now, one of which is the board only, and one of which is the traditional board with daughter board. And the board with daughter board is used in the upgrade board, which people can pledge for. It's in the plus model, and it's in the accelerated black and the accelerated magenta models. So 2 PCB SKUs. And of course the only difference with accelerated is the Raspberry Pi. So that doesn't really factor in, that's just a complete part, and all they need to do is solder the correct female header on the reverse to what is traditionally done for a Raspberry Pi Zero. So the PCB on the board only has to have some modifications made because there are certain components missing which hook up what would be the SD card slots. And I'll try and put a picture up again because I don't have anything in front of me, I'm just kind of imagining these things. So the board only needs the SD cards connecting to the SPI lines, so there'll be some missing resistors on that. And the joystick ports also need a different part number, and they need to be moved to what would be the right hand side of the board. And the buttons as well, of course, may not be connected up, may need connecting up, may need 0 ohm resistors to connect them. And then you have your board only. So that's 1 SKU. The majority of it is the same. On the other type though, the upgrade board and the accelerated and the plus, it's more of the traditional fair rinse and repeat of the last Kickstarter, excepting that there will always be modifications required. Modifications would be to do with issues which users may not even notice, but they have been observed and we want to stamp them out. And when I say we, as people probably know, I've stepped away somewhat from the project, but I do accidentally say we a lot because I've been invested in this for 7 or 8 years. So the board, there is the larger FPGA, around twice the capacity of the Kickstarter 2 FPGA, And there are a couple of other enhancements that are proposed. So those are provided in a document to our electronic design company. They're quite detailed, and so the electronics company will then have a look at those, turn it around, provide comments back. They will produce a bill of materials, which is every single component required for that PCB, and the Gerbers, or the Gerbers, depending on how you like to say it, the schematic effectively of how everything fits together. And then that will be sent across to China to be assembled. And typically the prototypes are not an automated process. They tend to have a lot of hand cranking because it's low volume. They tend to be a lot more expensive for that reason. There may be 10 or so made, and then those are sent to various members of the team. The electronics company will keep one, our manufacturing partner in China will get one, and then members of the team will receive those prototype boards, and then we'll go through an extensive series of tests to ensure that any corrections or any fixes we've asked for have actually worked. The enhancements that have been asked for work, and also that the base functionality works. Nothing has been impacted by it. So you're looking at electrical tests, you're looking at oscilloscope tests, you're looking at actual functionality of the Next itself. So you're firing the Next up, you're running it through its paces, you're soak testing it in various modes. You're doing basically everything that an end user would do and then recording the results. You're looking at Wi-Fi, you're looking at the Wi-Fi noise, is anything getting through onto the board and creating chatter on the audio. So everything you can think of really is then tested, and then comments are passed back, refinements may need to be made, and then hopefully at the end of it you get a fully working issue 5 PCB, or PCBs because we've got board only, and the update one. Cheers. So now you've got your case, you've got your keyboard, and you've got your PCB, which are pretty important parts of the package. And everything else, well, apart from one thing, everything else is fairly simple. You've got the power supply, you've got the inline switch, and I was going to say it's simple, but I was going to say the manual then, and the manual's far from simple. But that's been worked on for quite some time. So it's a known quantity at the end of the day. We've done it a few times before. As long as all the words are there, that gets printed in China. The PSU is an off-the-shelf PSU, which is just stamped with, the Spectrum Next stuff, or Sinclair. I can't remember what it's written on it now. I think I've got a different one myself. I'm just having a look at it now. Yeah, and the inline switch. And then you've got the box, which again is a known quantity. The ideal would not be to change anything about the dimensions of the box, because it's all kind of designed and everything fits in well. So it would be silly to change that unless there was a really urgent requirement to put something else in there. It's a perfect size, I think, at the moment. It is reduced in height compared to Kickstarter 1. So I think it's a good size, but the design of the box will probably change subtly. As from the Kickstarter 1 to the Kickstarter 2, where you had the blue accents on the Kickstarter 1, red accents on Kickstarter 2, I imagine we may see a different colour, maybe magenta or something, on the Kickstarter 3. And some of the wording may change, and screenshots on the back will presumably change again. Just to make it different and to highlight some of the new software that's come out since Kickstarter 2 happened. But again, it's just a change of assets in the artwork, and the factory has already proven that they can turn around the box, and all the inserts as well, I imagine, will be exactly the same. It's that high quality foam that we went for in Kickstarter 2, so I don't see that changing. So when you open the box, you probably won't observe any difference at all. It will look exactly like a Kickstarter 2, unless you went, of course, for magenta. If you went for the board only or the upgrade board, then you won't be getting the fancy packaging. You'll be getting something. It probably won't just be a cardboard box. It will probably have some elements of branding on it. It may look slightly nicer than a regular cardboard box. But if you pledge for the board only, then you are just getting the board in a box. If you pledge for the upgrade board, you're just getting the upgrade board in a box. So that's about it for the package, I think. I can't think of anything else. Case, keyboard, PCB, box, inserts, power supply, inline switch, manual. And that pretty much comprises what is the Spectrum Next. Of course, the Magenta will look different. And I don't know at this point whether the team are going to go with a different asset on the Kickstarter 3 box to reflect the fact that there is a Magenta Next inside there. I think it would be a good idea to do that, given the quantity. When I did the white Nexts at the end of Kickstarter 2, the box artwork remained as a black Next because only 50 white units were made, therefore, and there was a lot going on with the Kickstarter 2. The white ones could not take away from the resourcing and could not interfere with Kickstarter 2. That was one of the promises I made when kicking off that activity. So yes, the white Next have a black Next on the box. The Magenta Next maybe have a Magenta Next on the box because there are so many thousands of them. It's not going to be cost ineffective just to swap the asset out. And if the asset looks good in the context of the box itself, let's say they choose magenta for the accents on the box. And if the purple Next looks good within that scene, then maybe they will do that. And I think that would be a good idea. So that's about it. And I can't think of anything else really, apart from, of course, we have a lot of stretch goals. And those stretch goals are pretty much all software, even the core, stuff. ZX81, CPC, Commodore 64, expansions of or improvements to the QL core and the SAM Coupe core as well. I mean, at the end of the day, you're programming hardware. That's quite a lot of work in addition to the games as well. So you'll have one or two core writers who would be focusing on delivering those cores, and they would be selecting a jumping off point for those cores. So for example, there may be an existing FPGA based machine which has a good working core for it, say for example the C64 core, and that would then be taken and then adapted. And any core written for the Spectrum Next has to tick a certain number of boxes, because to be approved it has to work seamlessly with the hardware in the Next. And if you take something like a Mister, for example, and take a C64 core out of a Mister, it ain't going to work on a Next. You have to make some changes. You may find the FPGA is different. The memory type in a Mister is different to the SRAM used in the Next. And you'll find early on in the days of Kickstarter 1, or after that had delivered, a number of cores were appearing which kind of worked but didn't integrate well with the hardware on the Next. So you may find that you had to use a PS2 keyboard, you may find you had to use VGA, there was no HDMI support, you may find there was no joystick support, I can't remember, but there were a fair few deficiencies. And I know that for a core to be considered a Spec Next core, it has to tick certain boxes, and they all have to tick the same boxes, otherwise they don't make the cut. So core development really is aimed around getting to a fully working version of the machine it's trying to create, and typically that won't involve any bells and whistles or enhancements at that point. The baseline is get a Commodore 64 that works exactly like a Commodore 64, get a SAM Coupe that works exactly like a SAM Coupe. The only difference is that you would potentially have SD card access as a starter, which obviously a SAM and a C64 don't have. But in terms of the functionality, I wouldn't expect any of these cores to behave differently or to be faster or more implemented in terms of colours and speed and that kind of thing. The baseline will be, and the intention will be, just to get a working machine up and running which utilises all the Next hardware. And the important things to consider are getting it working not just with PS2 but with the Spectrum Next Matrix keyboard, and also to make determinations on what keys will map to the functions of these other machines. So on a C64, for example, you have buttons that don't exist, and on the SAM similarly as well. In fact, on all of them, you have buttons which are slightly different. So you have to make decisions in terms of, well, how do we get that function? And we understand already with things like function keys. You hold the NMI down and press number 1, and that does an F1, F2, F3, F4, and so on. But there are plenty of buttons which don't match at all, so decisions have to be made in terms of that mapping for the core. And then typically users will have the opportunity to be able to override those decisions via editing of a file, a text file or whatever. So if they don't like the default choice, they can make their own. The other thing, of course, is HDMI output and trying to get a proper HDMI at the right frequency, which has been done for the Spectrum Next. I think there's still some work going to be happening on that, because there are some monitors with issues and some people aren't getting sound on that. There is still development happening in the world of the Spectrum Next for that, but similarly that needs to happen as well with these alternate cores. So yeah, working with the keyboard matrix, working with HDMI, working with the SD card slot, maybe even presenting signals on the expansion connector so that something could be created down the line which would allow you to plug in some hardware peripheral to the back of the Next. Well, not into the back of the Next, but into the back of this thing, which would then plug into the back of the Next and would allow you to maybe use hardware. That's kind of a future thing, but they may put some signal lines in the expansion bus for that. The only kind of concern about that though would be if you had a Spectrum peripheral plugged in and you're reprogramming these pins to do different things, it could damage it. So I'm not sure about that. The other thing, of course, is Wi-Fi. I'm not sure whether Wi-Fi would be there out the box for these cores, but certainly they'd be trying to get as close to Nextification as possible, so that the SD card access, for example, could you have the cores coexisting on the same SD card? And in some cases I don't think you can necessarily, and in some you can do that. Where there is FAT32 support in another core, for example, you could potentially have the same files for a Commodore 64 and a Spectrum Next on the same SD card. You could browse through your SD card on the Next and you would see the Commodore 64 files there. Some cores may need a dedicated image file creating. I'm not sure at this point, we have to wait and see what happens. But if you can imagine, say for example, a C64 core running on a Spectrum Next, and if the C64 core had FAT32 support, you could actually use the Next as the primary core on the machine. And you could select the C64 game in the file browser on the Next, and it would automatically load the 64 core and load the game seamlessly. So there's a lot of potential for making the system very user-friendly in that context. So you don't have to reboot the thing, press space, change to the C64 core, browse through whatever mechanism's been created for the C64 in order to browse the games, etc. So a lot of potential there, but yeah, making these things Nextified using as much of the hardware of the Next as possible is the key. And as mentioned, a C64 Sun Coupe ZX81 core is not going to be, sorry, I forgot the CPC, is definitely going to be aimed at recreating the original machine, as opposed to a CPC Next or a Commodore 64 Next. But once you have that foot in the door, then the opportunities present themselves then, and especially around the ZX81 core, because you have to give it more memory, you have to give it SD card access. So you've already got a memory expansion in there. You've also got some ZXpand type functionality in there as well with the SD card access. But there are further evolutions of the ZX81 which people have created. The Chroma, for example. So down the line at some point, once the ZX81 core's been delivered, it may come to pass that Chroma functionality is added into there. AY may be added into there. And then people will say, well, it's just a Spectrum now. But if you know the ZX81, you know it's its own thing. So that's a lot to manage, all of the various cores that are being written, as well as the stretch goal games as well. And my feeling is that they would take longer to do than the other work streams that I've mentioned. The case, the keyboard, the PCB. You know, you may be looking at a month or two for the PCB until you've got a finished product. You could be looking at weeks for a case, you know, to get to where you want it to be. And the main thing around that is the time it takes to ship the samples, you know, back and forth. The shipping from China can take, you know, it can be 2 or 3 days. Once you get to the point where the factory feels that it's done and dusted deal, then samples are sent here and then they are signed off as golden samples, or one is signed off as a golden sample, sent back to China saying, this is the one, produce it. So yeah, it's an interesting time. It's a very tight time scale that has been given in terms of delivery in December. I could see if all things go well, with a good wind behind you, you could deliver the physical within that time, but there's a lot of software which takes quite a long time to write. A lot of people have their own personal lives and have jobs. So if you're writing a couple of games, then, you know, the parallel activities are going to become serial activities. So in my belief, I suspect that certain things will be delivered after, but that they will be delivered because everything is within the control of the team. So that's it. That's me rambling for God knows how long. How long have I been recording now? Whew. Yeah, so if you don't see anything up here, it's because I've forgotten to put pictures up. So yeah, I'll go back through this video in my editing software and I will throw some pictures up. And thanks for listening.